The United States military hit Iran again this morning. This is the fifth straight day of American strikes, and for the first time in this entire war, it happened in broad daylight. Let's get straight into it. Overnight into Tuesday, President Trump convened an emergency meeting in the White House Situation Room. According to Axios, which cited 3 sources with direct knowledge of the discussions, the meeting was called to plan a massive new offensive against Iran, one that would be far wider in scope than the Strait that have already been hammering the Strait of Hormuz region for days. In the room with the President, Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, and White House Envoy Steve Witkoff, along with other senior officials. That is essentially the entire National Security Command structure of the United States, gathered in one room, to talk about how much harder this campaign is about to get. Why does that matter? Because the read from inside that meeting is that Trump is now willing to escalate this war to the point of inflicting enough damage on the Iranian regime that it has no choice but to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and accept his demands on the nuclear program. This is not a defensive posture anymore. This is an offensive one. And this morning, we saw exactly what that looks like in practice. U.S. Central Command announced it had completed a second wave of strikes against Iran on Wednesday, this time targeting Iranian command centers, air defense sites, missile and drone capabilities, and coastal surveillance facilities. CENTCOM specifically said precision munitions were used to hit multiple locations, including Bandar Abbas, a major port city sitting directly across from the strait. Earlier in the day before that second wave, U.S. forces had already launched a 90-minute round of strikes against Greater Tunb Island, one of a handful of small islands that Iran uses to project military control over shipping lanes in the strait. Researchers have referred to islands like Greater Tunb as part of Iran's arch defense, a chain of fortified positions guarding the choke point through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas has historically passed. This is now the 5th consecutive day of American strikes on Iranian territory. And critically, this morning's operation was not conducted under cover of darkness. Every round of strikes up to this point has come at night. This time, it happened in daylight, and residents in Tehran reported air defense systems activating early Thursday local time, with at least one resident telling reporters they were woken up by a loud explosion in the capital. Let's back up and walk through exactly how we got here, because this didn't happen in a vacuum. This is the culmination of more than a week of rapidly escalating conflict, and honestly, of a war that's now been running, on and off, for nearly 5 months. This all traces back to February 28th of this year, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated wave of strikes against Iran, reportedly close to 900 strikes in a 12-hour window, hitting missile sites, air defenses, military infrastructure, and Iranian leadership. That opening salvo killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with dozens of other officials. Iran responded with a massive barrage of missiles and drones against Israel and U.S. bases across the region. That initial war ran for more than 5 weeks before the U.S. and Iran agreed to a ceasefire on April 7th and 8th. From there, the conflict shifted into a long stretch of brinkmanship centered almost entirely on control of the Strait of Hormuz, with Iran periodically closing it and the U.S. periodically threatening to force it back open. On June 17th, the presidents of the United States and Iran signed what's become known as the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, a 14-point framework negotiated with Pakistan as the lead mediator. That agreement set up a 60-day window for further talks on Iran's nuclear program, its missile arsenal, sanctions relief, and the future management of the strait. In exchange, Iran agreed to reopen the strait to shipping, and the U.S. agreed to lift its naval blockade. For about 3 weeks, that framework more or less held. Tankers began moving through the strait again, even if shipping companies were proceeding cautiously. It started falling apart in early July. Iran's own chief negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, said on Iranian state television that the strait remains one of the country's greatest strategic instruments of power, and made clear that Tehran views sovereignty over it as non-negotiable. Meanwhile, a Carnegie expert cited by CBS News noted that in the week since the memorandum was signed, the actual nuclear issue, arguably the entire point of the war, had barely been discussed at all. The 2 EOIDs had held just 2 substantive meetings in 22 days. Then, on July 8th, at a NATO summit event in Ankara, Trump declared the memorandum over, telling reporters bluntly that he didn't want to deal with Iran anymore and calling their leadership scum in the same remarks. He reversed the provision of the deal that allowed Iran to resume oil sales. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte backed the American strikes as absolutely necessary, and NATO formally added Iran's nuclear program to its summit agenda. That is the moment this current phase of the war actually began. And it's worth being clear about the scale of what's already happened over these 5 months. This conflict has killed thousands of people, the overwhelming majority of them in Iran and Lebanon, with dozens more dead in Israel and the Gulf states, and it has displaced millions of people across the region. This is not a limited skirmish. It is a full-scale war that briefly paused and has now resumed with real intensity. Now back to the current sequence. Go back to July 8th. A ceasefire and interim agreement between the U.S. and Iran, signed in mid-June, collapsed. Trump declared the truce over after accusing Iran of failing to honor the terms. Within a day, U.S. forces hit roughly 90 targets overnight along Iran's coastline near the strait. Iran responded by launching a barrage of drones and missiles at Jordan and at countries across the Persian Gulf. By July 11th, the situation had deteriorated further. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps attacked a Cyprus-flagged container ship transiting the strait, leaving one crew member missing. That sailor, from Pune, India, was later confirmed dead when his body was recovered by the Omani Navy. In response, the U.S. hit approximately 140 Iranian military targets in a third round of strikes that week. Iran, in turn, launched what it called Retaliato, RI strikes on Prince Hassan Air Base in Jordan. The UAE said it was responding to missile and drone threats of its own. Bahrain activated air raid sirens and told residents to shelter in place. Qatar's Ministry of Defense said it intercepted a missile attack aimed at the country. This was, by that point, no longer a narrow U.S.-Iran exchange. It had become a regional crisis touching nearly every country along the Gulf. On July 12th, Iran's Navy declared the Strait of Hormuz closed after claiming it fired warning shots at a vessel attempting to cross what it called an unauthorized route. Then came July 13th and 14th, arguably the two most dangerous days of this entire war so far. Iran's Revolutionary Guard said it had struck and disabled two vessels it labeled rogue supertankers, accusing them of ignoring warnings and attempting to cross a mined route. That announcement came just hours after the UAE reported that two of its own oil tankers, the Al Bahia and the Mombasa, were hit by Iranian missiles while sailing through Omani territorial waters. Those two tankers were carrying a combined 46 crew members, including 30 Indian nationals. One of them was killed. 8 others were wounded. India's government summoned Iran's deputy chief of mission in New Delhi to formally protest the attack, calling it deeply concerning. Separately, a Norwegian-owned chemical tanker, the Stolt Magnesium, was also struck by a projectile northeast of Kolhat early on July 14th. In direct response to that wave of tanker attacks, the U.S. Treasury Department reimposed sanctions on Iranian oil exports that had been lifted under the earlier ceasefire agreement, and U.S. Central Command launched another wave of strikes against Iranian military sites clustered around the strait, including targets on Qeshm Island. Iranian state media reported that those strikes killed an Iranian Navy lieutenant, identified as Hamidreza Degani, at the southern port of Jask. By Tuesday, July 14th, the U.S. military had reimposed a full naval blockade against Iranian ports and carried out a fourth consecutive round of overnight strikes. That round hit an Iranian army barracks roughly 120 miles inland, killing at least 7 Iranian troops and wounding, according to Iranian officials, 260 more. The Treasury Department also announced it was targeting a sanctions evasion network tied to Mohammad Hossein Shamkhani, which officials described as one of the Iranian regime's most profitable financial engines. Also on the 14th, in a smaller but telling development, Trump backed away from an earlier proposal to charge a 20% toll on any cargo passing safely through the Strait of Hormuz. He said Gulf state leaders, he specifically referenced kings and emirs, had reached out and offered instead to make what he described as billions of dollars in trade and investment deals with the United States. Trump framed this as a win, posting that oil is now flowing at record levels because of, in his words, the power of the U.S. military, and he specifically credited Secretary Hegseth, General Kane, and CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper by name. Which brings us to today, July 15th, 5th straight day of strikes. Second wave hit this morning. And in the middle of all of it, there was actually one piece of good news. Trump announced on social media that Iran had released an American woman who had been detained in the country since December 2024. She was later identified by her attorney as Dana Karari. Trump called her release a gesture of goodwill from Tehran and said she is now safely out of the country and in good condition. But that single positive development is happening against the backdrop of a war that is very clearly not winding down. It's ramping up. Iran responded to this morning's strikes with attacks of its own on Jordan, Bahrain, and Kuwait. Missile alert warnings went out in both Bahrain and Kuwait. Jordanian air defenses reportedly shot down 3 incoming Iranian missiles. The Kuwaiti army said its systems intercepted a wave of hostile Iranian drones. And Iran's Revolutionary Guard has now explicitly threatened to close what it called all other export corridors that benefit the U.S. and its allies, a direct threat to widen the economic damage of this war well beyond the Strait of Hormuz itself. Now, let's talk about what Trump himself is actually saying, because his own words over the last 48 hours tell you exactly where this is heading. In an interview with Fox News' Trey Yingst, conducted just before the Situation Room meeting, Trump was asked directly whether strikes on Iran would expand, and specifically whether the U.S. was considering hitting Iran's energy infrastructure. His answer: he's saving energy targets for later, but he made clear the campaign is far from finished. He said Iran would be hit hard that night, hit hard the following night, and hit hard again after that. Then came the line that's now defining this stage of the war. Trump warned that if Iran doesn't come to the table, next week brings what he's calling Power Plant Day and Bridge Day. In his words, next week they will knock out Iran's power plants, and they will knock out Iran's bridges unless Tehran agrees to negotiate. That is a direct threat to target Iranian civilian infrastructure, a category of target the U.S. has not hit up to this point in the conflict. And it's worth being clear-eyed about what that would actually mean. Striking a country's power grid and its bridge network is not a surgical military operation against weapon systems. It's an attack on the systems ordinary civilians depend on to live their daily lives, and experts have noted that kind of damage can take years to repair. There have already been reports that Iran has been encouraging civilians to gather on bridges, specifically to try to deter American strikes on that infrastructure. Yingst also pressed Trump on whether he was ruling out a ground campaign. Trump didn't rule it out, but he was notably careful in how he answered, saying he wouldn't want to say that, while also suggesting that in a limited capacity, other countries might carry out ground operations rather than U.S. forces directly. He specifically declined to rule out some kind of operation involving Karg Island, Iran's most important oil export terminal, saying that if the U.S. degrades Iran far enough and deep enough, he would consider it. Trump was also asked about Pickaxe Mountain, described as a heavily fortified, deeply buried site that American and Israeli officials believe Iran may want to use for its nuclear program. Weapons experts have said the facility may sit too deep underground for even America's most powerful bunker buster bombs to reach. Trump's response was that the U.S. has good stuff capable of going deep, and that while nobody knows for certain how much activity is actually happening at the site, the U.S. has it under surveillance, and if even a small amount of activity is detected there, it will be struck, and struck hard. Later in the interview, Trump also addressed Iran's remaining missile stockpile, saying the regime has fired hundreds, even thousands of missiles and drones over the course of this conflict, that Iran has largely spent its most capable weapons already, and that the vast majority of what's left has been intercepted before reaching its target. On the diplomatic side, Trump said his negotiators spoke directly with Iranian officials this week and delivered a blunt message. Come to the table, or there won't be anything left to negotiate over. Iran's response so far has been defiant. A foreign ministry spokesperson said this week that Iran currently has no plans for negotiations with the United States. Iran's top negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, said that if Iran isn't seeing any benefit from the memorandum of understanding it signed with Washington, Tehran has no reason to keep adhering to it. Let's talk about the economic fallout, because this war is already reshaping global energy markets in real time. When the naval blockade was reimposed and strikes intensified, Brent crude, the global oil benchmark, surged more than 9.5% in a single day, its biggest one-day percentage gain in over 6 years, settling above $83 a barrel. U.S. crude, West Texas Intermediate, jumped roughly 9.4% on the same day. War risk insurance premiums for ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz have spiked sharply, and according to Lloyd's List Intelligence, ship owners and charterers have been pausing decisions on whether to even attempt the crossing. Kpler data showed confirmed vessel crossings through the strait declining by roughly 52% week over week during the height of the tanker attacks, with remaining traffic reverting to far more defensive, cautious routing. During the last blockade period, before the now collapsed ceasefire, CENTCOM said it redirected 142 ships and disabled 9 that refused to comply over a roughly 2-month stretch. Expect similar numbers, or worse, as this current blockade continues. It's also worth noting that, even with all of this, vessel traffic hasn't stopped completely. On July 14th, maritime tracking data showed 21 confirmed crossings through the strait, with commercial traffic, crude oil, LPG, methanol, iron ore, making up the bulk of that movement. The U.S. military's stated goal throughout this entire operation has been to restore enough confidence in the safety of the strait that global shipping can resume at something closer to normal volume. So far, that traffic is best described as a trickle, not a flow. The broader economic picture stretches well beyond the price of oil at the pump. Before this war began in February, roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade and about a fifth of global liquefied natural gas shipments passed through the Strait of Hormuz. When the fighting first broke out, tanker traffic through the strait collapsed by more than 90% almost overnight, and the International Maritime Organization reported that at one point, roughly 20,000 mariners and 2,000 ships were effectively stranded in the Persian Gulf with nowhere to go. That disruption triggered real fuel shortages and rationing across parts of Asia that depend heavily on Gulf oil. An analysis comparing trade flows during the war to the prior year found that the United States and Russia were actually the biggest financial beneficiaries of the disruption, picking up tens of billions of dollars in additional export revenue as buyers scrambled for alternative sources, while Gulf countries that couldn't route around the strait, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE among them, saw their own export revenues decline. Every time this conflict flares back up, as it has this week, that same basic dynamic reasserts itself. Global energy markets absorb the shock, and the countries most dependent on that single waterway pay the steepest price. Now let's get into the analysis, because there are real questions here about how far this is actually going to go, and whether strikes alone will be enough to force Iran to the table. The Institute for the Study of War has assessed that despite the sustained U.S. strikes of the past week, Iran retains both the ability and the willingness to continue attacking commercial shipping in the strait. Their assessment is that Iran's threshold for disrupting shipping traffic remains low, largely because Iran continues to rely on asymmetric capabilities, drones launched from deep inside its own territory, which are inherently difficult for the U.S. and its allies to locate and preempt before launch. Analysts have also pointed out that the current campaign echoes a familiar pattern. Pressure campaigns intended to force de-escalation through military force have a mixed track record historically, and there are real questions inside Washington about whether continued strikes will actually bring Iran to the table or simply harden the regime's position. There's also a broader regional dimension unfolding at the same time. Trump has been engaging directly with regional leaders. He met with Syrian President Ahmad al-Sharia on the sidelines of the recent NATO summit in Turkey, and has spoken with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu about the trajectory of the broader conflict. Vice President Vance has publicly maintained that the general trajectory of the U.S.-Iran Memorandum of Understanding remains positive, even as the strikes continue to escalate around it, a position that, on its face, is difficult to reconcile with what's actually happening in the Gulf right now. The mediation architecture around this war is also under real strain right now, arguably more than at any point since the February strikes began. Oman, which has served as one of the primary channels between Washington and Tehran throughout this conflict, was itself struck by Iranian drones. Notably, just a day after Iran and Oman had concluded talks on a proposal to manage strait traffic through two separately controlled shipping corridors. That timing alone brings doubts about whether that corridor proposal survives. Qatar, which has hosted technical talks between U.S. and Iranian negotiators, has also come under Iranian attack. Pakistan, the country that brokered the original Islamabad memorandum back in June, has seen its mediation track go essentially quiet since early July. As of this week, the 60-day window that memorandum established for resolving the nuclear issue, a deadline that lands on August 17th, has not seen any substantive nuclear negotiations take place at all. In practical terms, every diplomatic channel that got this war paused back in June is now either damaged, sidelined, or simply not being used. On the aviation and international side, the European Union's Aviation Safety Agency has told commercial airlines to avoid the airspace over Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon through the end of August. Spain has refused to allow the U.S. access to its bases in the country, prompting Trump to publicly call Spain a worthless NATO partner. Regional governments have generally split along familiar lines. Saudi Arabia has expressed support for giving diplomacy a chance, while also urging Iran to seize the opportunity to avoid further escalation, while the UAE has pushed for the strait to be reopened unconditionally and for a broader plan to address Iran's missile and nuclear programs. Domestically, this escalation is not without political pushback. House Democrats have criticized the administration for resuming full-scale military conflict with Iran without seeking congressional authorization for the war, arguing that the administration has never clearly articulated why the bombing campaign began in the first place, nor what the actual exit strategy looks like. That criticism is likely to intensify if the power plant and bridge phase of this campaign actually goes ahead next week, given how directly that would put civilian infrastructure in the crosshairs. So where does this actually go from here? Based on everything we've seen and heard directly from the president and his own national security team over the past 48 hours, here's the realistic picture. The current phase of strikes, military, coastal, air defense, and drone-related targets, is going to continue through the rest of this week, regardless of what Iran does. Trump P has been explicit and consistent about that. The real inflection point is next week. If Iran does not move towards serious negotiations, Trump has now said on the record repeatedly that the campaign expands into Iran's power grid and its bridge infrastructure. a category of target that would mark a serious escalation beyond anything struck so far in this war, and one that would almost certainly increase both civilian impact and international scrutiny of the operation. At the same time, there are early signs Iran may not be entirely closed off to negotiation. The release of the American detainee this week, however Trump chooses to frame it, is the kind of gesture that sometimes precedes a diplomatic opening rather than further escalation. Oman has also reportedly drafted a tentative propo to manage straight traffic through 2 separately controlled shipping routes, an idea that emerged from meetings between Iran's foreign minister and his Omani counterpart. Whether that proposal survives contact with the current pace of strikes is very much an open question. What is not in question is this. The United States is now 5 days into a sustained bombing campaign against Iran, has reimposed a full naval blockade, has expanded strikes to Iranian islands and coastal military infrastructure, and has explicitly warned that power plants and bridges are next. On the target list if Tehran doesn't return to the table. Iran, for its part, has continued launching drones and missiles at U.S. allies across the Gulf, has struck multiple commercial tankers, killing and wounding civilian crew members, and has publicly stated it currently has no plans to negotiate. Oil markets are reacting accordingly. Shipping traffic through one of the world's most critical choke points remains a fraction of normal volume, and neither side has shown any sign, as of this morning, of backing down. This is a fast-moving situation, and it is very likely to change again within the next 24 hours. I'll be back with the next update the moment there's something new to report. Stay with me for continuing coverage as this develops.